Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Northcott. I was professor at New College for many years. I moved to a job in Germany in 2018 and then 2019 took a position at the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies here in Indonesia. I'm talking to you today about the COVID-19 crisis that we're all living through in different parts of the world. And I thought I'd start just with a kind of personal angle on it, because I think all of us have been affected by it in different ways. And I think that our context in this situation can sometimes explain some of our reactions and reflections on events such as this. And this is, whatever we feel about its origins, causes, the way it's running, for many people, the biggest crisis, social crisis they've lived in their lives. That will be the case for me. I lived with my parents who would tell me stories about the Second World War, but I've never lived through a war in the country I lived in. And yet there are aspects of this crisis which resembled world crisis like the Second World War. So I was living and working in the city of Jakarta in Java, Indonesia, when it became clear that the crisis was going to go global and that planes would come out of the sky. And I had to make a choice between moving back to the UK. My family still live in Scotland, and staying here in Indonesia. It was a hard choice, and I was aware that it was a choice that might mean that I wouldn't be back in the UK for a year, possibly. I've lived abroad before, so in a way it wasn't an issue, but yeah, at a time of crisis, one does think about returning, in a sense, to the home country. And indeed, many people around me in Yorkshire, many Europeans and Americans did just that. Sometimes on the orders of their governments. American Fulbright scholar that I was working with at ICRS, he went back early to the States. The British embassy in Jakarta issued an instruction to British citizens to return home. And I was receiving indications that there would be possibly a major crisis, social unrest here in Indonesia, that this was a pandemic on a scale that would challenge the healthcare systems, possibly even the basic life support systems in terms of food and so on, in a developing country like Indonesia. However, I decided to stay. I actually moved from Yogyakarta to Bali. My Bahasa Indonesia is very limited, and I was living in a village outside Jogja, and I felt that the circumstances of possibly being locked in my house in a country where I wasn't able to speak a great deal of the language where neighbors were not ideal. And I also noticed a bit of increase in concern and even fear on my morning jog through the rice fields around my village. And I felt a little uneasy, I have to say, about that. I've decided then to move to Bali. I have lived in Bali on and off for a few weeks here and there, and there are a lot more people here who speak English. It's taught here in the schools, and in addition, there are many features to life in Bali which I felt would make the crisis more than bearable, possibly very pleasant to stay here while the crisis went on, and then I could move back to Georgia. But the other advantage of being here, of course, is that I retained my status as a visiting professor in the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies at the University Gajah Mada, where I'm now working, and I was able, in the same time zone, to carry on teaching as normal online with my students, which I was very keen to do, and supervising PhD students, and collaborating in research projects and all the other things one does as an academic in a university. I ended up renting a villa from a friend of a friend, which has turned out to be very pleasant. It even has its own little swimming pool and a beautiful garden, which you can see behind me. A lot of outdoor living space, which suits me very well. And I'm in a village called Penastanan, where there are possibly 20% of people like myself, Europeans or Americans, living sort of full-time in Bali. And I must say I found it a very welcoming and very pleasant, indeed very beautiful environment. And life in Bali has continued much as normal. We are encouraged to wear masks outside, which I have to say I find ambiguous. I wear a mask on my motorbike for pollution purposes, but during exercise, it's actually unsafe to wear a mask, and so I don't go walking or jogging wearing a mask, but I will wear a mask in, for example, the local supermarket, though I rarely go to the supermarket. I prefer the small shops. But otherwise, life is fairly normal here. The main concern of my neighbors here in this village, my Balinese neighbors, is the downturn in the economy, which has taken place because of the significant drop in the number of tourists living in Bali or visiting Bali at any one time. And there are normally 2.5 million tourist arrivals every year to this island. And while sometimes it does look like Bali is being overwhelmed by visitors, of course it does provide a significant amount of employment to the more than 2 million Balinese people who live here and for whom it is their main source of income, other than growing rice and so on. So there is clearly a concern in villages like this about those who've lost their jobs. Some people have gone back to the north of Bali, where a lot of Balinese have originally come from. I'm here close to the town of Ubud, which has become a bit of a hub for tourist visitors. The name Ubud means healing or place of healing. It is a quite magical place, set in the rice terraces on a sort of slope that goes from the coast in the south of Bali all the way up to the volcanoes, some of which are still live in the middle of the island, in the north of the island, most especially Gunung Agung, the king mountain or king volcano, which I can see when I go walking here or jogging here through the rice fields. However, having said that, there's been no sense of health crisis here in Bali. There's a lot of messaging about COVID-19. There's a lot of encouragement to wear masks, despite their dubious medical benefits outside of clinical settings. There's plenty of peer-reviewed science on that. If you would like me to inform you about it later, I have read quite a lot of peer-reviewed science on masks. As someone who takes exercise a lot, I'm quite interested in how much oxygen reaches my lungs, and so I am aware that masks limit oxygen intake, and therefore I don't normally use them. There have been very few formal deaths from COVID-19 in Bali. The numbers are, when I arrived, there'd been like 2 or 3, and 2 of them were foreigners who come with the disease. One, a British woman, actually, who knew she was ill when she arrived. The main health problem in Bali at this time of year, we've just moved from the wet season to the dry season, is dengue fever. Dengue comes from Aedes mosquitoes, which breed in stagnant water, and in the dry season that's more of a problem than the wet season because water stops flowing as frequently, and containers may not be overflowing anymore with water, and if people aren't careful, containers can become reservoirs for Aedes mosquitoes. And I know of people secondhand who have got dengue. I've also heard of cases where people have gone to clinics or hospitals with dengue fever, which gives you a high fever principally, and also makes you very fatigued. And then they're told when they get there they have COVID-19. This is very ambiguous because, number one, the fees for treating COVID-19 are something like 5 times the fee for treating dengue fever. But number two, when people get out of hospital and return home, if it's known that they were said to have COVID-19, they get ostracized in their villages. And I've even heard of cases where people have been accused of having COVID-19 as a form of ostracism, which is unfortunate. But it does reflect a broader reality. On the whole, I would say that nonetheless, Bali is not a place living in fear. One goes out every day, one sees people smiling and working in the rice fields as normal. There are cafes, restaurants, construction workers. Some businesses are closed, though more are open now because more local tourism is now happening. Flights from Jakarta are now happening to Bali, and indeed visitor numbers have gone up somewhat to the benefit of the Balinese who had lost their jobs temporarily. Most people in Indonesia do not have salaries. They live day to day in the cash economy. And it is, of course, the informal cash economy which has been most harmed by the kinds of measures which were at one time commended by the World Health Organization as appropriate responses to COVID-19. Though, in fact, Asia as a whole did not adopt the kinds of fierce nationwide lockdowns that were adopted first in Italy and then in most of Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand. China only ever selected to lock down certain areas where there were outbreaks. First, of course, Wuhan itself, and South Korea only locked down particular locations where they were aware of an outbreak. South Korea has had a very fierce and apparently very effective track and trace procedure, which they originally developed for the SARS-1 breakout in 2003. Here in Indonesia, the president of the country, President Jokowi, had a very difficult decision. There are 280 million people living here in 17,000 islands. The Indonesian archipelago is on the ring of fire above the Southern Ocean, with a significant number of very active volcanoes, including Gunung Agung, which in this island was active only months ago. Jogja, the volcano near Jogja, is the most active in Indonesia. It's 40 kilometers only from the campus where I teach, and it's been active all year. So Indonesia, from volcanoes and earthquakes, is used to natural disasters. I mean, when I say used, they happen a lot. And people are used to nature visiting them with events which they are not in control of. That is very different to the experience of most Europeans and North Americans, where nature is largely subdued. And so this disease experience, in a way, is something novel for the lifetimes of many Europeans who have never before experienced a situation where a hidden microbe, invisible to the naked eye, could result in a complete change in almost all the normal circumstances of everyday life. But as I say, here in Indonesia, because this is a very live part of the Earth's crust, and the Earth is a living force, we might even say a living being, because it's filled with magma, and that magma is constantly rising to the surface in different places, often under the sea. We don't even see it. But it does create a different sense here in Indonesia than you have in the West. In Scotland, where I was living for many years, the volcanoes are dead. I mean, after student, I actually worked in New College on the side of a volcano. Indeed, the Royal Mile is effectively, if you think about the structure of the Royal Mile, it's a slope, running all the way from the castle down to Holyrood, and that slope, if we dug down, you'd find rubbish from the old medieval city and rubble, but you would also, if you went down far enough, find the slope of a lava overflow from a very, very ancient volcano, which is now extinct. So, intriguingly, even Edinburgh is a geomorphic space, but the time when Edinburgh was shaped by volcanoes is so far in the past that we don't think in these terms. When I visited Edinburgh a year ago after having lived in Jakarta, it suddenly hit me that actually, yes, Edinburgh too is a geomorphic space. And what is also intriguing about Edinburgh is that you have the volcano has shaped the town. So at the top of the town, you have the defensive fort, where traditionally in prehistoric times, forts were always put on hills, so you could see all around. And then in the middle, you have the sacred temple, which is St. Giles Cathedral. And at the bottom, you have the sovereign power, the seat of the sovereign, the royal palace. So you have the power of the earth at the top of the hill, you have the temple in the middle, and the courts, of course, the law courts all around the temple, the church. And at the bottom, you have the sovereign power, the earthly sovereign, the human sovereign. So, but as I say, Edinburgh is an extinct volcanic environment, but nonetheless, it is shaped by earthly powers and earthly forces. And those earthly forces have arranged a space in which human beings still order their lives. And it's intriguing for me also that the Parliament was built next to the seat, the traditional residence of the sovereign, and not in some other part, at the bottom of that lava flow, that ancient lava flow from the castle to Holyrood Park. So here in Indonesia, then, as I say, people are more used to events which they are not in control of, and that these events may produce disasters of different kinds. But also, I would say here in Indonesia, people are much more inclined to connect such events with the god or gods. There's a story told about Bali. It goes back to 1963 when President Sukarno was president of this country and he wanted to get the tourist industry going. And he decided that a good way to do this would be to build a large hotel in the Sanur beach area on the edge of the city of Denpasar in the south, near the airport in Bali. So he built this 10-story, I think it was 10-story hotel. And the height of the hotel was completely against the customs in Bali, which is that you don't build above the height of a coconut tree. Now, coconut trees can grow to 50, 60 feet. And that does allow you 2 or 3 stories, but certainly not 10. Anyway, he built a hotel, and then he decided to invite people from all over the world to kind of launch the hotel and launch this new, what he hoped would be a kind of revenue-raising tourist industry here in Indonesia. And he set a date for a ceremony to open the hotel and invited people from India and the United States and Germany and Netherlands and so on, dignitaries, to come on that date. Now, people of Bali have a largely lunar calendar. Their ceremonies and traditions on what is sometimes called the Island of the Gods, are Hindu in origin, though Balinese Hinduism is now quite different in many ways to Hinduism anywhere else. It's a distinctive religious tradition and has grown up over at least 2,000 years. The day that the president chose for his ceremony did not fit into the Balinese calendar. It wasn't part of any other ceremonial season. And in addition, he built this hotel against the traditions of the island. So what actually happened was that Gunung Agung, the biggest volcano here, exploded about 10 days before the proposed ceremony, covered the west coast of the island in ash to a distance of 30 kilometers or so from the volcano, which of course included Sanur. And basically that was the end of the ceremony. It didn't happen. All these dignitaries were unable to fly here. The planes couldn't come. There was too much ash in the sky. And in any case, the beaches were covered in ash. And that was that. So the president of the third largest democracy in the world was prevented by Gunung Agung from doing what he wanted. And for the Balinese, this was just evidently the island saying, and the gods saying, you can't do what you want here. There is an order. There is a way. There is a tradition. There is a calendar. There are rituals. There are ceremonies. There are gods who ought to be honored and respected. There are boundaries, limits to what can be done here on this island. And this hotel and the ceremony were exceeding those limits. And the mountain responded and stopped what was to be done. It's not surprising then that in Indonesia, and it isn't just among Hindus, Muslims too, and Christians still believe that natural events and social events interact with the will and the intention of God or gods. They don't separate, as we do in the West, nearly so sharply, science and religion, or nature and culture, nature and religion, history and human history and the history of the gods. For Indonesians, there's a constant intertwining between political realities and social realities and spiritual realities. And so for many Indonesians, the COVID-19 emergency has been as much a social emergency as a health emergency. There was no point at which health services were ever overwhelmed. In most of Indonesia, the only city, so far as I can tell, where there was even a risk of such overwhelming was the city of Jakarta, which is the second largest urban area on Earth. It's heavily polluted. And given that the evidence seems to be, in the early days at least, of this COVID-19, which is the disease syndrome caused by SARS-CoV-2, this new mutated chimeric virus, which seems to have its origin in a bat, but somehow morphed into quite interestingly, humanly formed virus, a virus that could infect humans. The disease, COVID-19, as I say, was originally thought to be a respiratory disease, and if you live in a heavily polluted city, you're more at risk, particularly in later life, which is the demographic the disease has principally targeted, of becoming seriously ill from a respiratory disease. So there were reports in March of a risen number of cremations. And this then, the government of Indonesia is based in Jakarta. The government therefore felt there is something like the kind of emergency that the WHO has been predicting beginning to unfold in Jakarta. Therefore, we ought to produce regulations in response nationwide. However, even in Jakarta, the lockdown was never a European lockdown. I mean, I don't even like the word lockdown. I think it's very unfortunate discourse. It comes, of course, from the US prison system. It goes back to 1983 when the decision was taken right across the system to lock prisoners in their cells for significant periods of time. And it was done electronically, mechanically, and it was called the lockdown. I think the idea that you jail people in their houses for a pandemic, where the infection fatality rate has turned out to be below 1%. Most scientific papers I've seen put it between 0.3 and 0.7% of those who are infected, which is at 0.3, it's within the range of flu. At 0.7, it's double a normal seasonal flu. From my perspective, it was always inappropriate to jail people in their houses for a disease with that kind of infection fatality rate. But that was what was done in many countries. Belgium in Europe had the fiercest lockdown. I have an association with the university there, guest professor at the Evangelical Faculty of Theology in Leuven, and I learned from a colleague that the maximum fine in Belgium for going outside without documented proof that you were going to a supermarket to purchase essential food supplies was 4,000 euros. Now, most people in Belgium live in apartments. They do not have gardens or outdoor space or even balconies. So effectively, the lockdown in Belgium confined people to breathing the most polluted air, because indoor air is much more polluted than exterior air, and prevented them from taking exercise, meeting their friends, family who did not live in their house, and all the other aspects of normal life. And Belgium had the worst outcomes from the COVID-19 emergency of any country in Europe other than the UK. Sweden, of course, which everyone knows, did not go down this road, have much better outcomes than Belgium. People say, oh, well, Belgium is more crowded. Well, there are cities in Belgium that are as crowded as Stockholm, like Antwerp and Leuven, and there are people living in small towns and rural areas in Belgium as there are in other parts of Europe. So I don't feel myself that population concentration is relevant to that issue. Anyway, here in Indonesia, President Jokowi expressed skepticism early on about the kinds of quite extreme measures that were taken in Europe and the United States, and was resistant to them. I continue to believe his reasoning was social justice. Some of my colleagues said, no, it's because he cares about the economy and it's economism, and he's putting the economy before people. Well, what is the economy? I mean, the economy is people. How do people get bread in the modern world? How do they get rice, unless they grow it themselves? Some people do here. They get it through cash. Where do they get cash from? They get it from the economy. In the West, a number of people, millions, have been given cash by governments because their businesses and their offices and workplaces have been closed down. That wasn't really an option here in Indonesia. There is no welfare state equivalent to what Europeans have. Even in the United States, millions of people have registered as unemployed, but have been unable to register in the federal government unemployment system because there are now mostly online procedures, and these have not worked adequately for the 45 million people who are now unemployed in the United States. And so even in the US, people are already going hungry because of losing their jobs. So I firmly believe that President Jokowi knew this. Hunger still kills in parts of Indonesia. The island of Sumbawa, for example, which had that huge volcanic explosion of Tambora in 1815, which led to a winter across the world that lasted 3 years. It was, some would say, the first truly global event in history. It was an event which joined every place in the world. Every place in the world experienced a change in the weather from the volcanic eruption of Tambora. And it was the fiercest eruption in what we call the Holocene, 10,000 years. And the island never really recovered. And still today, when you go there, you can see a landscape that's obviously something extraordinary happened. And malnutrition has, until quite recently, been an issue for people in Zimbabwe. So this is the country that President Jokowi governs. It's a huge democracy, but people were living in all kinds of different circumstances, most of them still in the cash economy. So he did not lock down Indonesia. He permitted the provinces to develop their own COVID-19 strategies. And the province of Bali, where I am living, took a relatively relaxed approach. It wanted businesses to close early, so at the moment businesses here are still closing around 8:30 in the evening. It discouraged large gatherings, very similar to Sweden actually. So in Sweden the maximum was 49 during the emergency, and here at one point it was 10, though that seems to have been relaxed now. There was a great deal of encouragement for villages, or banja as they're called, to develop their own strategies, and the state here in many ways is very bottom-up still, very communitarian. There's a great interconnection between the banja, the kampung, the village structure, the temple or the mosque in Java, and the governance structure of the village. And so government messages are filtered down to the headman in each village, and there are committees governing the land and the water and the kind of human circumstances, and then here in Bali, a committee governing the temple. And that structure, broadly speaking, has provided what welfare can be provided. In particular, the villages here in Penastanan, they've gathered in charitable gifts from businesses and individual households, and then distributed these in the form of rice. These villages around here have also developed, during the COVID-19 emergency, a waste project where people are encouraged to gather plastic bottles and other plastic items, clean them up, and put them in big bags, take them to the village centres or waste banks, and there they are weighed, and in exchange they are given rice. So the local state has been much more active here than the nation state, because that's the nature of a country of this huge size, and which in some respects is quite federal, as it needs to be, given the more than 2,500 miles stretch of the Indonesian archipelago. And there will be islands in Indonesia where there has been no emergency, because there's been nobody's visited. That was the other thing that did happen. Planes were pulled out of the sky, and inter-island travel was stopped. So for some months one became aware that one was here in Bali and there was no way of getting away. So, but day-to-day life here has been much more normal. I mean, I can go out and work in a cafe, a co-working cafe, or I can work in my house. I can meet new people. Bali is kind of quite a touchy-feely place, both local and foreigner. One meets people, gets to know them, one gives them a hug when one sees them, one shakes their hand. We just don't experience here the kinds of restrictions on social life that people have experienced in other parts of the world, and I'm very grateful for that. So, of course, having lived through this putative pandemic, not seen any evidence that it is really a pandemic. I mean, a pandemic is like the plague, where 20, 30, 40% of people were wiped out by the plague in the Middle Ages in Europe. Here, the deaths have been in the teens, compared to a population of 2.5 million. And that's no different from dengue or flu or typhoid. So I myself and people that I know around me here are somewhat skeptical about the larger narrative. Theologically, then, I've given you a kind of context for why I might see things differently to some other academics and theologians, if not the majority of academics and theologians that I actually know, in the UK and the US, for example. Though I have found some of my continental colleagues more skeptical than my Anglo-Saxon English-speaking colleagues about what's actually going on. As a theologian, how do I assess what's happened in relation to COVID-19? Do I think it's the punishment of God against civilization? No, I do not. Do I think it's because we have become too both relaxed but also unthinking in our domination of this planet? And this has provoked natural forces, in a sense, to come back upon us. I think there's something in that. The two mainstream stories that we hear about the origins of the virus are, number one, that it emerged spontaneously in the Wuhan market, where it is said that the Malayan pangolin was sold live alongside chickens and other animals, and the evidence seems to be that the DNA of the virus is originally the SARS-CoV-1 virus, which was isolated in a number of labs, first in China when it first emerged in 2003, and was 90% a bat virus and mutated through another animal into a disease which could infect human beings. It was then said that SARS-CoV-2 was the same, that it mutated zoonotically, as it said, through the Malayan pangolin, and then somehow a human host, most likely in the wet market, was infected. However, a Lancet paper was published back in March, which indicates that the first victims of the virus in Wuhan had no connection with the wet market, and they did not live near the wet market. In China itself, in January, when President Xi announced the fact that this novel virus had appeared, he at the same time announced new biosecurity regulations for the country's virology laboratories. And since then, there has been an argument waging, really, in newspapers, but also in peer-reviewed journals, as to whether this virus emerged zoonotically or whether it emerged from a laboratory. Now, again, another part of the background, my background, is that for 20 years I've been investigating the ethics of genetically modified organisms. This began with the Church of Scotland project, organised by Donald Bruce for the Society of Evolution and Technology project of the Church of Scotland. Back in the 1990s, a team of theologians, social scientists, and natural scientists, including Ian Wilmot, who, of course, created Dolly the sheep, who at one point we actually met when she was alive. You can now see her in aspic or formaldehyde in the National Museum, if you're so inclined. We met for 2 years, produced a book called Engineering Genesis. And in that book, I expressed the view, that was collaboratively written, but I expressed the view that the risk profile of genetically modified foods was such that we should not be doing this. But the view was not unanimous by any means. We had in that group scientists, not only from Roslin, but also from Aberdeen, who were at the James Hutton Institute, who were actively modifying organisms in the laboratory and working on them, getting them out into agricultural fields. Of course, since then, GM has gone global, although the UK and Europe decided they wouldn't have genetically modified foods. I was then involved in a Templeton funding project based at the University of Durham in the noughties. And in that project, we looked at the impacts of genetically modified foods on food cultures, on people, on environment, in 3 countries, India, Mexico, and Brazil. So this is like 15 years after I had first expressed prudential concerns about genetic engineering and its impacts on the planet and on ecosystems. And what we found was that genetically modified foods were producing really unfortunate and problematic changes in human diets. They seemed to be associated with an increase in gastrointestinal illnesses in all 3 countries. But furthermore, they were producing really troubling environmental impacts, not the least of which was evidence from Brazil that the characteristic genetic modification which had been introduced in Brazil to the soya plant, which was to resist the chemical glyphosate known as Roundup. It's used it's an full spectrum herbicide, had jumped into plants close to the soya plant, and the farmers there were now dealing with triffid-like weeds 20 feet high, huge trunks and leaves, that were just taking over their crops, and they cannot get rid of them by any means except bulldozers and machetes. So, yeah, the modification, rather like in Jurassic Park, nature had found a way. The modification had jumped from the laboratory into the field, into other species. And that's a highly dangerous modification once it's out there, because it makes other plants far more resistant, even to natural pest controls, let alone artificial ones. So what I didn't know, though, was, well, in the UK, we banned genetically modified foods in fields. We still continue with genetically modifying foods, of course, in labs. I knew that, but I didn't know we were genetically modifying viruses. I know that in Porton Down now, which is our bioweapons facility, we in the UK are modifying viruses. I now know that in Fort Derrick, they're modifying viruses. They were modifying viruses in a laboratory in Chapel Hill in North Carolina. I worked in that area in 2008 as a visiting professor at Duke University. And the same is going on in China and Japan, in Switzerland and Germany, and in labs around the world. And what is going on in these laboratories is that viruses found in nature, viruses found in humans are studied, but they're also modified. They're engineered, including the engineering of viruses such as Ebola to infect human beings. And in fact, President Obama was so concerned about the risks of these procedures that he passed a federal government regulation banning the modification of viruses in labs. In 2014, however, this was resisted, not the least by a man who's quite well known now, Fauci, who was the head of the US Center for Disease Control. And Fauci, it's a matter of public record, used public health funds to transfer his research from a laboratory in North Carolina to the laboratory in Wuhan. Now, whether or not he was working on modifying SARS-CoV-1, I don't know. But I feel there's at least as much evidence that this virus emerged from the Wuhan bioweapons grade virology lab as it emerged from zoonotic transfer. And the reason I say this is because a growing number of scientists are saying the same thing. And a recent peer-reviewed paper argued that there was something very strange about this virus. Many doctors would agree with that, when they've seen it. It's not like the flu. It's not like a normal coronavirus, i.e. colds, the coronaviruses are roughly 200 of them already in circulation. In particular, though, the point the scientists make in that paper is that the virus seemed to be strangely already formed to infect humans. There isn't the typical morphology of a virus that needed to develop so it would infect humans. The jury is still out on it. But whether it came from the wet market or whether it came from the laboratory, it seems to me that the second point I made about the theological and ethical significance of this crisis stands, which is that we have become too casual in our Baconian-originated domination of the natural world. And we think we can do what we like, tear down forests, replace them with soybean, wreck soil structures so they can no longer absorb CO2 from the air, and they need constant dousing with artificial ammonia to grow food, fill the atmosphere with prehistoric carbon burned in motor cars and jet planes, and even, as we now know, change the climate, reduce the number and diversity of species on the planet, extract 90% of all the living beings that were in the ocean, which we have done through trawling, including even in protected areas around Britain, where trawlers are still at large. These protected areas are virtually useless. By these things, we have reduced the fertility of the earth, the diversity of the earth, the beauty of the earth, but I think also arguably the resilience and the safety of the earth as a habitat for human beings. And so I do think that the crisis we're living through is a moment, a dramatic moment, when we need to rethink our relationship with the divine creation. Therefore, the social crisis we're experiencing is in some ways connected with the ecological crisis, which has been ongoing really since the Industrial Revolution, filled the skies of British cities with what John Ruskin famously called Manchester's devil darkness, when the average mortality in Victorian cities, age of death was 25. Of course, that was partly because so many children and young women died in childbirth, but nonetheless, laborers often died at 30, 35. They lived 24/7 in some of the most polluted cities in human history. Though the wealthy, you've all read Jane Austen's novels and George Eliot, they could leave town the weekends, they could put their children in the country, and so on. So they lived to much older ages, even in those very polluted cities. And we have similar conditions in China, in cities today. Burning coal to smelt the aluminium casing of this very fine 2014 Apple MacBook Pro on which I'm speaking to you. So thirdly, then, I would say, as a theologian, what's been very interesting about the crisis, but perhaps even more the social response to the crisis, is that it has shifted the balance temporarily between human influence and the influence of other creatures. I've seen this in photographs from friends on Twitter and Instagram of animals turning up in their gardens and birds that they had not seen for years and years. I've seen photographs of the Himalayas from northern Indian cities. People had never seen the Himalayas in many of these cities before, but the skies were clear. I've seen photographs of Beijing where they can see a blue sky again, where children had never seen blue sky in many Chinese cities. And even here in Bali, where, as I say, one can still go around. I can travel around on motorbike from north to south, east to west. But there are far fewer scooters on the road, there are far fewer trucks, there's far less traffic. It's much quieter, more peaceful. One can go out in the evening, as I did last night, to a beautiful restaurant overhanging a huge, beautiful jungle ravine. And it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's heavenly. I mean, it's just magical. And many of us who have not suffered either from the virus or from mental health problems from being isolated by house arrest, and I don't want to underestimate those, and who have not gone hungry because of the social crisis, have, I think, felt something different in our relationship to creation. And I know that Christians and people of other faiths have also at times expressed a feeling that this is also something spiritual and not just a human nature thing. So, but the fourth thing I want to say and here I move more into kind of political theology type space, is that from the outset, I was suspicious of the mainstream narrative about this virus because of the dominant note of fear. Now, in all spiritual and ethical traditions that I have studied, fear is seen as a problematic emotion, and an emotion often connected with wickedness or evil or with wicked men who wish to stir up fear in other people to dominate them. You go right back to the Bhagavad Gita, where the prince is considering whether to go to battle or not. Battle with his own relatives. And he is told that if you don't do this, your world will fall apart, they will dominate you, and then, and so he's stirred up, his friends stir him up with fear, but he's courageous and he refuses to go to war. You look at the stories of the prophets, Elijah, for example, believes that he's the only one who's not bowed the knee to Baal, and he gets a little fearful, anxious. And God says, no, you're not the only one, you're not alone. Thousands who have not bowed the knee to Baal, I am with you. And you look at the life of Christ, a life of extraordinary courage, where the gospel records hardly record a moment of fear, except, of course, in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Christ is said to have prayed, if this cup can pass from me, may it be so. Who, if he had any inkling of what was to come, and was a human being, he wouldn't be human if he did not feel the emotion of fear. And yet, in the end, it was courage and not fear that dominated. St. Paul, of course, and the other writers of the New Testament developed an ethics and a spirituality which was really the diametric opposite of fear and domination. Faith, hope, and love are the theological virtues for St. Paul. And joy, perfect love casts out fear. For me, is the core message of the New Testament. And so when I saw the rise of the fear narrative in all newspapers and media, and I actually felt the effects myself physically, my first response was, well, I suppose I needed to keep in touch. Then after a few days, I thought, no, it's not a good idea. I know fear is bad for me, spiritually and mentally. I'm living alone here. I actually can't deal with this emotion pouring through my head all the time. So I just stopped looking at all mainstream news channels and filtered very carefully my interaction with mainstream news. Mainly then I turned to WhatsApp and Twitter, which provided an effective filter. I didn't need to read any stories. People could post stories on Twitter, but I didn't even need to read them. But I could also see a range of views on Twitter about the crisis as it unfolded. So my own views on the crisis have been formed, as I said, by a context which is rather unique for perhaps many people watching this. It's not been like your experience. It's also been filtered by living in a country where the divine and the human and the natural are still believed to be completely overlapping, as they are in the Christian scriptures. It's been informed by my sense that this crisis is somehow connected with our loss of humility, our Promethean domination of this planet. But it's also been informed by my sense that the politics of this crisis, the economics of this crisis, do not seem to be really about the well-being of ordinary people, at least most of all, the most vulnerable. So if you look at the UK, the UK has had this house jail at the time of speaking for 3 months. It's caused a rise in suicides, depression, child abuse, domestic violence, but much more broadly mental health. And we don't yet know how many jobs have been lost. 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, we don't know. But unemployment is one of the worst things that could happen to people in their lives. It actually generates mortality because it leads to people dying younger if they don't rapidly resolve the situation of a lost income, a lost workplace, lost respect for colleagues and social life and so on. Take that away from millions by social regulations that close down so many small, medium-sized enterprises and the cash economy, and you harm the lives of millions. So the most vulnerable in Britain were the people who were already ill and in their 80s, the most vulnerable to this disease, I mean. And it is they who have suffered most from the disease, principally because the government took the, I think, extraordinary view, both in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that the WHO was right. It was a terrible disaster unfolding. The hospitals will be overwhelmed. Therefore, the hospitals needed to be emptied of existing patients to allow for the huge influx that was expected to come. So what happened was people who were already ill and had COVID-19, so they had COVID-19 plus another condition, say heart disease, or they'd had a stroke, were moved from hospitals into care homes en masse. This didn't only happen in Britain. It was done in Italy. It was done in many countries. They did it in Sweden as well. It was done in the United States. And it resulted in a huge and very quick loss of life in the care homes. In April, there was a huge loss of life in British care homes. And that, of course, seemed to, in a sense, confirm, at least initially, the wisdom of the house arrest and all the rest of it. The suspensions of freedom. It's all in the Coronavirus Act 2020 for people who live in Britain. I think it's worth reading that act. It runs to 320 pages. The US Act runs to over 1,000 pages. Hard for me to believe that was written in just a few days. So in Britain, we were told that the house arrest was to save the NHS. But the NHS was never overwhelmed by this crisis and was never at risk of being overwhelmed by it because the infection fatality rate of this disease is not significantly greater than the flu in 2017-18. So I have been led then to be rather suspicious of the mainstream narrative and the mainstream response to this virus. And I have begun to believe, as a growing numbers of other people have, though they tend to be on the right rather than the left wing of the political spectrum, as it happens, that there are other agendas going on in the government responses to COVID-19, which are not necessarily connected with the health and well-being of their populations. And some of those agendas have been suggested in a range of contributions, scholarly and otherwise, to be connected with what Foucault famously called biopolitics, the use of illness by the state to increase its power over the state. And there's never been a time in human history when government has had more power over its citizens than now. And that includes in England and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the Second World War, when people were still free to go out on the streets, even during the Blitz, to attend cinema, as my parents did, on a particular occasion when a stick of bombs from a German plane landed on the high street when they were in a cinema and shook the cinema. And they were watching a film together. That couldn't happen now because cinemas have been closed. Dentists have been closed. I have a number of friends who are now on antibiotics because they can't get dental treatment. So my own view is, I know it's controversial, and I'm told it has provoked anger amongst some people when I've expressed it on Twitter, and I'm embarrassed, and I'm sorry about that. I don't wish to do that on Twitter. I need to be more careful, I think, in what I say. I try to explain how my contacts have shaped my view of this disease. And yet I've also tried to say that I think there's something deeply concerning in the public response to it. I sincerely hope that the Coronavirus Act 2020 is rescinded within the first 6 months and is not renewed by Parliament, because it is a state of emergency. It involves a suspension of democracy. There are no elections taking place as long as that act remains in place. And I have a grave concern that it will be used to cover for what I think will actually be a bigger emergency for the UK than COVID-19, which is the portent of a no-deal Brexit, when fresh food supplies and drug supplies and other essential supplies like oxygen, for example, daily come through Dover and principally Dover, but also New Haven, Felixstowe, will result in significant shortages in the shops, far more significant than anything was experienced with COVID-19. And I feel it would be irresponsible for any government to allow that to happen. It will be a choice. There's absolutely no reason why the UK needs to leave the UK without a deal, the EU without a deal. We can extend the transition indefinitely. From the EU side, I think that would be their preference. So they are fed up with us. They're sick to the back teeth of our government. And in some, I know many Europeans would just like to see the end of it. But on the other hand, I think there are many good people in the European Union and even in the European Commission who do not wish harm on the British people. And they know that a no-deal Brexit will harm our country. And the United States, the proposed deal with the United States, trade deal on drugs, deal on healthcare and access to public services and so on, I think will be a double harm if it is negotiated and brought in by the Johnson, Cummings, whatever we call it, current government. But of course, the emergency created by COVID-19 and the emergency legislation would be a perfect cover for doing all of that. But there are even larger agendas, which some suggest, behind the government responses, and the curious way in which they all were unfolded around the world in kind of lockstep. And when one speaks about these things, one gets accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Well, what is a conspiracy? It's when one or two people get together to fix prices. Adam Smith spoke about that in The Wealth of Nations. It's the commonest conspiracy in the world, fixing prices between business people. There are other kinds of conspiracies. I didn't know that we were genetically modifying viruses. Why was that not more public? I mean, I'm actually in the field and I really didn't know this was going on. It's being done largely in secret. We raise animals largely in secret. It's quite hard to see what goes on in an animal factory. And yet animal factories are the places where the most dangerous pathogens, other than these genetically modified virology labs, emerge on Earth. So they're kept secret. We pour antibiotics into the animals to keep them alive, because they would die in these heavily overcrowded conditions without antibiotics. And then these factory farms create pathogens. Most people don't know this. But if you're going to train to be a vet in the UK, you better get used to this, because one of the things you will be required to do in your life, if you're working in the mainstream, not in just in small animals, is to allow farmers to pour antibiotics into insanitary habitats. Animals living in insanitary habitats without antibiotics would not live, or at least would not put on weight. So a lot of things are done in secret in Britain and other countries. I mean, I didn't know until very recently we have a significant number of advisors actually in Saudi Arabia from the UK, not only using our weapons, but helping the Saudi Arabians to use them to kill innocent Yemeni people. And Yemen is one of the poorest countries on earth. It's utterly scandalous. But I didn't know until very recently that we were doing these things. There are many things that are secret that one day will be shouted from the rooftops, whether on earth or in heaven. To admit that is to say really nothing exceptional about human life and human society. That there are elements of what we're living through that do seem to have been coordinated in advance. And that there are other elements of the proposed response which do seem to benefit certain groups and corporations. That in particular, there are elements of the so-called new normal, not only social distancing, but the broader aspects of this. The proposal that we will have, that Tony Blair has come out saying this must happen. Bill Gates has been saying it for more than a decade. That we should all bear some kind of mark, either in our passport or even on our wrist, which evidences our health record, our vaccination record. There's already a system up and running in India along these lines for over 1 billion people. The data is held in a Microsoft database. The patent I found online using Google, the patent for the software, which can also be downloaded onto a phone and used offline by health workers. It already exists. I didn't know this until a couple of months ago. So this crisis has more than anything turned me against the big state. It's turned me against Baconian secular scientism with its huge disrespect for the earth. And it's turned me against any policy which raises its head in such a way as to blot out the authority, the divinity, the lordship of Jesus Christ and the power of God over human affairs. And that brings me then to my last point. Bali is one of the few places in the world during this crisis where worship has continued on a daily basis. I mean, I'm here in a house that's owned by Hindus, and there are kind of Hindu features, such as this one in this house, where sacrifices are offered daily by my hosts, who are very generous and kind people. Incense sticks and so on. But that's replicated everywhere. Every night you see, in the morning, small offerings are placed much like this on the boundaries, on the borders of the houses in which people live, in the street. And then people go to the temple. There are not as many or as large ceremonies as there were in the past, but the ceremonies take place and they follow the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar. I went to a moon festival just over 10 days ago. It was a full moon festival. It was a beautiful occasion. We sat around a fire pit with an Indian priest. And for me as a Christian, it was particularly lovely because we sang Christian as well as Hindu songs, and some in English as well as in Sanskrit. It was a beautiful ecumenical event and a wonderful celebration of the full moon. I'd never been aware before, in the way that I am living on Bali, of the phases of the moon. Though, of course, it was the Venerable Bede in the 6th century in the northeast of England who first accurately charted the phases of the moon in order to help clarify the date of Easter initially. But then, of course, it served a much larger purpose in sorting out the kind of mess that Julian calendar had created in relation to the circuit of the Earth around the Sun and of the Moon around the Earth. So here in Bali, then, we've had public religion throughout this crisis. And in many other parts of the world, public religion has been closed down. In the UK, I was particularly shocked. Well, in England, anyway, the Archbishop of Canterbury actually ordered that churches should be padlocked. Now, I then looked at the regulations. The Coronavirus Act regulations did not require churches to be padlocked. They said that there should be, I think, very small numbers. So it was possible to hold funerals, provided that not too many people came. But this didn't happen. The church, the established church at any rate, but as far as I can see, all churches just closed their doors. I found that very troubling. I know a lot of worship went online, and I've attended the occasional service. But for me, this was the triumph of the Baconian religion of science over religion. It was an extremely ambiguous triumph. We were told that the fear of death from a disease, which it now turns out, and indeed we've known this for quite some time, the first study of the infection fatality rate was based on the Princess Diamond cruise ship, where 3,000 people were locked up with an air conditioning system which was infected with the virus for over 6 weeks. And the majority of the passengers, over 1,500, were elderly. And a significant number, something like 20-30%, already had what are called comorbidities. So they were on medicines with the ship's doctor. They were going on holiday while sick, but not sufficiently sick to prevent them going on a cruise, which isn't very taxing physically. Now, to date, only 13 people have died of COVID-19 from those 3,000 people looked up. The first scientific study that was published by Japanese scientists of the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 was based on that cruise ship in March, and it came out around 0.7%, I'm sorry. There have been others since. A study conducted in Santa Clara County found a similar infection fatality rate. Then there were studies done in a German town, and there are now dozens of peer-reviewed papers where the infection fatality rate comes out at around 0.7. Some put it lower, down to 0.2, which is a mild flu season fatality rate. So I think that it was never justified to close down churches and mosques and temples. And I think that this was a combination of the fear of death, but then the messaging of fear that flooded all the world's media by some strange set of circumstances. We know, for example, anybody who spoke against us for a while on YouTube was censored. We don't really know who ordered the censoring, who was doing the censoring. Someone in the United States was presumably doing that. And this fear messaging led to the end of public religion. At the moment, as far as I can tell, in the UK, church worship is still not resumed. I don't know what the impact on the churches will be in the medium term, but one of already seeing talk of redundancies and of reduced jobs being available for ordinands. So, I mean, if you're a Christian as I am, then the use of science, in particular that appalling model by Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, he's a huge recipient of grants from the Gates Foundation, of course, this is now well known. He massively overpredicted mortality from mad cow disease. He suggested 10,000 people at least would die from it in the UK, and so far it is said that 200 people have died from mad cow disease. He massively overpredicted the infection connected with foot and mouth disease. This led to a huge cull of animals all over the UK. I remember pyres in the northeast from that event. Again, his models have been challenged, in fact, on this occasion by a professor at the University of Edinburgh who challenged his work in peer-reviewed papers back in 2000 as Professor Thrushfield. So he massively overpredicted deaths from SARS-CoV-1. He came up with some ludicrous number. Millions of people were going to die from SARS-CoV-1. So he's a serial alarmist. And he's not a medic. He's essentially a physicist, a mathematician. And since his paper was published by Imperial, the paper which scared the UK and the US governments, who were actually reluctant to do this, into their own respective extreme states of exception, the paper's modeling is wrong. And the mathematical modeling is completely inaccurate and filled with flawed reasoning. But of course, I mean, most of us are not epidemiologists. I didn't know that you could publish papers in epidemiology. You're not an epidemiologist when you're simply a physicist. But we are familiar with the danger of models in the air. And that's what led to the global financial crisis in 2008. Have we learned nothing from that crisis? A tiny number of economists predicted that there was anything wrong with the huge debt-fueled asset price inflation of heavily mortgaged properties being sold to people who clearly couldn't afford them in many states of the United States of America, which led to the global financial crisis. But a tiny number of voices said this can't go on, and they were ignored. And we had the crash because everyone was just following the models. Or, Standard & Poor, assessments of these weird credit derivatives, in which the mortgages were packaged up. So, in conclusion, then, I would say that this raises big issues in what we call the science-religion space, to do with, are these competing narratives? Kind of Baconian narrative that the world is a machine, it's not ordered by hidden forces like spirits and so on, or mentality. And then religion is over here somewhere, just talking about souls and feelings and God. Well, ultimately, of course, if you tear these two apart, you not only kill nature, as Carolyn Merchant argued in her book, Modern Science and the Death of Nature, you ultimately kill God, because God becomes an irrelevance. What can God do for you except possibly make you feel nice if you sing hymns in the right way on a Sunday morning? If God has no impact, if your feelings and thoughts and prayers to God, your mentality, your spiritual mentality has no impact on the world around you, just stays in your head, well, in a sense, atheism follows. So my own view, this brings me back to Indonesia. And Indonesia, I find a very spiritual place. When you smile at people here, I haven't smiled a lot. I mean, it's a lot of heavy stuff. But when you smile at people here, complete strangers, they smile back. I mean, if you go jogging in Europe and you smile at people, quite a lot of people they'll actually think you're really weird. And they won't smile back, and they may even look away or even move a bit to the side. I mean, how did that happen? I'm delighted to be in Indonesia during this crisis. It's not that the country is not suffering. There has been an economic downturn. There are a number of people who've lost jobs, who've lost income. I've seen the power of communitarian responses here on the ground, which have hugely relieved the sort of suffering that's gone on. But I've also seen a reluctance by governments and spiritual leaders to drive home the fear narrative, to drive home what is really, I think, a kind of revival of a kind of master-slave dialectic, which we're seeing in the power of the big state and the big corporations, Amazon, Google, Apple, to name but three, but of course the big pharmaceutical companies, who stand to benefit hugely, not only from the crisis, but possibly from a global attempt to enforce global vaccination against a disease which we still don't really understand. So for me, ultimately, this crisis is about faith and faith in God. Just as the origins of what we call a theology of crisis, going back to the First World War, were about faith. Karl Barth grew up in a time as a theologian, was being formed in the time when his teachers had gone along with German nationalism, with a kind of blood and soil mentality, which led to the border wars between Germany and France, and ultimately embroiled much of the world in a horrendous war. And that then led the settlement of that war, the Versailles Treaty, led to the mass enslavement of Germany to debt, which ultimately then led to the rise of Hitler in the Second World War. Barth lived through all these events, and he felt that what we needed to do was to say, God and nation are totally separate. Blood and soil is one thing. Faith and God is something else. God came to earth in Christ from a far country to redeem the earth. That's the kind of core message of the church dogmatics. But for me, the problem with that theology of crisis was that it didn't address the ecological crisis that we're now living through. So I feel in a way that COVID-19 is a sort of theology of crisis too, or requires a kind of theology of crisis too, where we acknowledge that the initial theology of crisis was right in some respects, in its critique of nationalism, in its critique of blood and soil, in its critique of technology. And that was a big part of the theology of crisis, some of the most important texts I can think of then, not only by Barth, but also by C.S. Lewis, his beautiful book, The Abolition of Man, and the work of Jacques Ellul. To me, these all came out of the theological crisis in the sense that technology was bringing about a troubling new order in which, as C.S. Lewis predicted in The Abolition of Man, the power of humans to dominate nature would rapidly turn into the power of humans to dominate humans. And so I feel in the end of that, The Abolition of Man is hugely prophetic, actually, as a text for what we're going through now. There is an order, an implicate order in all things. It is connected with our brains and with our spirits and with the divine and with the incarnation and with the divine spirit. And scientists are still uncovering the huge range of connections, not least our immune system and the way that our immune system functions better when we have a healthy earth, we eat healthy food, we have healthy communitarian relationships and spiritual lives. There's lots of growing evidence about this thing. So for me, we need a new paradigm, in if you like, a new theological crisis too, which acknowledges the wisdom of the first theological crisis, but builds into it a more integral, holistic theology of creation. As it happens, I'm working on a book called God and Gaia, where I'm trying to unravel these matters in the midst of, and hopefully towards the denouement of, the current crisis. May I end then by saying, if you have persevered with me through what is at least an hour talk, I'm very grateful to you. And if there's to be a Q&A online, I also look forward to the opportunity to be challenged by you and questioned by you in times to come. I finally say, have hope, have faith, and above all, love those who are near you, those who are far away, God and the creatures around you. Love, perfect love, casteth out fear. Thank you.